Welcome to this journey once again of going through the book of Psalms. And in particular, we are looking at Psalms 46. Now, Psalms were written out of the experiences, sometimes of the writer, and sometimes of the people around the writer, and sometimes both. And therefore, there is this practical aspect that comes from Psalms. Therefore, they help us to connect with timeless issues that people face and man has always faced. And I've always said that experiences of yesteryears are normally quite similar with the experiences that we have today. Now, in this particular psalm, it is not so clear the reason for which it was written for. But one thing that it looks like it was a psalm that was written out of some kind of anxiety. And anxiety is normally brought by circumstances that are not easy. The title here is that we are told that this was a psalm from the sons of Korah. And the sons of Korah were known to be Levites from the family of Kohath. And by David's time, it seems that they served in the musical ministry, the musical aspect of the temple worship. It is said that as you look at this psalm, Martin Luther, the reformer, actually said this was one of his favorite psalms. When in greatest distress, he was known to call for this psalm, saying, "Let us sing the 46th psalm in concert, and then let the devil do his worst." That is said by John Trump. And therefore, this psalm, when you look at it, it encourages us to have our hope in God, to put our trust in God. In the anxious moment, to put our hope and our trust in God, and to rely on God fully. In other words, to believe in God wholeheartedly. To rely on God's power, to rely on God's providence, to rely on the gracious presence of God with all the things that we may be going through. And as I look at these Psalms, I see just 4 things which are actually somehow rhyming. That in those times of anxiety, times of distress, let's be reminded about the presence of God between verse 1 and verse number 3. In the times of distress, let us be reminded about the provision of God, and that you find between verse 4 to verse number 7. But in the times of distress, let us put our trust and our hope in the power of God between verse 8 and verse number 9. And lastly, in the times of anxiety and distress, let us always realize the peace of God. Verse 10 to verse number 11. Therefore, if you prefer the presence of God, the provision of God, the power of God, and the peace of God. Let's look at the presence of God, verse number 1 to verse number 3. The psalmist says, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of need. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains will fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, the mountains quake with their surging." The psalmist is reminding us here and say that God is gonna be his refuge. And that is my prayer for us, that God will always be our refuge. A refuge is that place where when you are beaten by everything else that is going around us, you run into this place and suddenly there is a peace, there is a quietness, there is not so much noise, but that place of solace. And therefore, this psalmist is saying that this God who is a refuge and the strength, he is an ever-present help in times of trouble. And that's why I talk about the presence of God. That God is always with us. That God is always around us. And that God is always even within us. Which basically means that when we seek him, we will definitely find him. Therefore, in times of distress, the first thing is we need to always be reminded about the presence of God. Number 2 is the provision of God. And when you come to verse number 4 to verse number 7, it says, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells, that God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us, and the God of Jacob is indeed our fortress. That along this river God provides. Along everything that we go through, to be reminded that if it is lack that is causing the distress, our God provides. And therefore the psalmist says here that there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. The third thing that I see is the power of God. Verse number 8 to verse number 9. He says, come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes walls cease the ends of the earth, to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. And therefore, if at all the distress that was being talked about here was because of the enemies that were surrounding the children of Israel, the sons of Korah in this Psalms number 46 reminds us that our God is able, that our God is powerful, that our God has the last say in each and every single distressing moment that we go through in this journey of faith. The power of God. There is nothing and absolutely nothing that God is not able to do. And then lastly, it talks about the peace of God. Verse number 10 to verse number 11. He says, be still and know that I am God, that I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The Lord of Jacob is our fortress. In times of distress, of course, when we have the presence of God, and when we are reminded of the provision of God, and when we are reminded of the power of God, the sons of Korah in this Psalms number 46 are reminding us that we can have that peace, and that peace that transcends all understanding. Not ignoring the circumstances around us, but being aware of the circumstances around us, but also being alert that our God is able to intervene in the circumstances. And therefore, this psalm reminds us once again that no matter what we go through, put our hope in God and God alone, as we are aware of His presence, as we are aware of His provision, as we are aware of His power, and therefore that will be followed by the peace of God. And that peace of God is a peace that transcends all understanding. Now, there are many things that cause anxious moments in our lives. There are many things that cause distress in our lives. Is it sometimes lack of finances, economic situations that are very tough in the world right now, caused by, if it is not COVID, and if it is not the war in Russia, if it is not drought here in our country, Kenya, the economic circumstances are just so difficult. Sometimes there is a distress when we lose our loved ones, because we are in this place that we do not just understand. How will we be able to go on with life without this loved one that we cherish so dearly? Sometimes it's a relationship that has gone south. Sometimes it is a business opportunity that is not coming through, or the job that we depended on and it is now no more. They cause us distress. And in times of those distress, put your hope. I put my hope. We put our hope in God and God alone. That is a lesson from this Psalms number 46. And we put our hope in God alone because we know within our hearts and beyond any shadow of doubt that our God is always present, that the provision comes from God only, that the power of God is within reach. And when we have the power of God within reach, by the grace of God, the peace of God that transcends all understanding, and therefore the psalmist says, "Be still and know that I am God."